You don't survive 6 deployments by being the loudest voice on the radio. You survive by being the one nobody remembers to be afraid of. For 3 years, the only thing Dana Kessler flew was a Cessna full of nervous student pilots and a tow bar for other people's broken airplanes. She kept her flight suit folded at the bottom of a footlocker she never opened, tucked behind spare tires in a storage unit she barely visited. She kept her call sign folded even deeper than that, somewhere she thought she'd buried it for good. Nobody at Desert Rim Airfield knew that the quiet contractor, who fixed their landing gear, had once flown danger-close gun runs with her wingtip inside 100 feet of American soldiers pinned down in places most people never learn the names of. They knew her as the mechanic. They knew her as, "Ma'am, can you hurry this up?" They did not know her as Wraith. That was about to change, because 600 miles east, in a black pine forest, a SEAL platoon was about to run out of ammunition, out of daylight, and out of hope, and the only voice that could save them belonged to a woman nobody at that airfield had ever thought twice about. The base itself never slept, not really. Somewhere a generator hummed, somewhere a radio crackled with routine traffic, and somewhere a screen door banged in the dry wind that never quite stopped blowing across the runway. Dana had learned to sleep through all of it years ago, back when sleep was rationed and old habits like that never really leave. Before we dive back in, if you're just joining us, drop where you're watching from the comments, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one, and give this video a like if you're already hooked on where this is going. Okay, back to the hangar and back to Dana. Dana wiped hydraulic fluid off her knuckles with a rag that had seen better decades, the kind of rag that had gone stiff in places and soft in others from years of the same abuse. The Nevada morning was already pushing 90 degrees, heat shimmering visibly off the tarmac, and the smell of jet fuel and hot asphalt hung over Desert Rim like a blanket nobody could shrug off. Somewhere behind her, Captain Elias Reyes was barking into a radio about paperwork nobody had signed properly. He hadn't looked at her twice since he'd arrived 8 months earlier. To him, she was a line item. Contractor, aircraft maintenance, GS scale. Not a pilot. Never a pilot as far as he was concerned. She liked it that way most days. The old A-10 parked at the far end of the flight line, tail number 081, belonged to nobody in particular anymore. A retired airframe kept flyable for static displays and the occasional airshow taxi run nobody took seriously. Dana was the only one who still pre-flight it every single week, out of habit more than any actual orders. She told herself it was just good practice. She never quite believed herself when she said it. At 0640 that morning, the base radio room picked up a distress call on a frequency nobody was supposed to be using anymore, a frequency from a war that was supposed to be over. She'd learned a long time ago that being underestimated wasn't an insult worth fighting. It was cover, and cover was the only thing that had ever kept her alive long enough to matter. The forest floor was black with shadow even at first light, pine needles slick with dew, and the air smelled like wet bark, gun oil, and cordite drifting low through the trees. Master Chief Jim Osric pressed his back against a granite outcrop and did the math in his head, the way he always did when the math was bad. 6 men. 2 wounded. 40 rounds a rifle. Maybe less if he was being honest with himself. 3 clicks from the extraction point, and every click crawling with hostiles who'd clearly been waiting for them since the moment they hit the drop zone. "Overwatch is down," his radio man said, voice flat with the kind of calm that only comes right before actual panic sets in. "Repeat, Overwatch is down. We are danger close on all sides, Chief." Osric had been in worse spots before. Not many. Not much worse than this one, if he was honest. He keyed his radio, forcing his voice level. Any station, this is Havoc 1-1, troops in contact. Request immediate close air support, how copy?" Static answered him first. Then a voice, clipped and official, from an operations desk 400 miles away. "Havoc 1-1, be advised, no CAS assets available in your area of operations. Nearest fast movers are 90 minutes out. Recommend you hold position and conserve ammunition." 90 minutes. Osric closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, feeling the weight of it settle into his chest. His team didn't have 20. He'd fought in enough valleys in his life to know exactly what hold position really meant when nobody was actually coming to help. Osric glanced at the two younger men beside him, both barely into their 20s, both trying very hard not to look as scared as he felt himself. The forest didn't care, the pines swaying the same way they had before the shooting started, and would again long after it stopped. Back at Desert Rim, the duty radio man, a 22-year-old airman named Cole, sat bolt upright when the emergency traffic bled onto the guard frequency he was monitoring out of boredom more than duty. He didn't recognize the call sign. He didn't recognize the unit designator. But he recognized panic when he heard it in a stranger's voice, and he did the only thing his training had ever told him to do. He patched the traffic to the ops desk and started yelling for anyone with rank to come listen. Captain Reyes picked up the handset like it was somebody else's problem, which, technically, on paper it was. "This isn't our area of operations," he said flatly, barely glancing at the readout. "We don't have assets cleared for that mission profile. Log it and forward it to group. Let them sort it out." Dana was 40 feet away, elbow deep in a hydraulic line, when the words "troops in contact" came crackling out of the open door of the radio shack. She didn't move at first. She told herself it wasn't her business anymore, hadn't been for years. She told herself a lot of things these days, and most of them were lies she'd gotten very good at believing. Then she heard the unit designator repeated a second time, sharper this time, "Havoc 1-1. And her hands went completely still on the wrench, grease dripping unnoticed onto the concrete. She hadn't heard that call sign in 6 long years. Not since a ridge outside a village whose name she'd tried very hard, and mostly failed, to forget, where a young petty officer named Jim Osric had once looked up at her jet like it was the only good thing left in the entire world. He let it go. Some fights weren't his to win that morning. Cole kept the channel open anyway, some instinct telling him this wasn't a call he should let go quiet, whatever Reyes said about jurisdiction and mission profiles and proper channels. She walked into the radio shack without being invited, which she never did, and Reyes looked at her the exact way he looked at anyone who wasn't wearing rank he personally recognized. "Kessler, this is an active ops floor. I need you back at the hangar. This isn't the place for you right now." "Say the unit designator again," Dana said, ignoring him entirely. "Ma'am, I don't have time to—" "Say it again," she repeated, and something in her voice made even Cole, 22 and half asleep from the night shift, sit up straighter in his chair without knowing why. Reyes exhaled through his nose like a man humoring a child who'd wandered in off the street. "Havoc 1-1. SEAL platoon, cross-border training exercise gone live, pinned in mountainous terrain, no close air support available for 90 minutes. Now, if you don't mind, I have an actual crisis to manage." "There's a jet on the flight line that can be airborne in 11 minutes, Dana said, cutting him off cold. Reyes actually laughed, short and humorless. "Tail 081? That thing's a museum piece, Kessler. It doesn't even have a current maintenance release for a combat sortie, let alone weapons." "I do the maintenance," Dana said quietly. "I know exactly what it does and doesn't have a release for, better than anyone on this base. You're a contractor." Dana rolled her sleeve down over the old, faded scar running from her wrist to her elbow, a habit so old it wasn't even conscious anymore. "I used to be a great many things, Captain," she said. "Get me clearance to the flight line. Right now." Reyes opened his mouth to argue further, then closed it again, some old instinct telling him this particular fight wasn't one he was going to win standing still. Cole watched from his console, half convinced he was about to witness a court-martial, or something he didn't yet have a name for. Reyes didn't get her clearance. Not right away, anyway. He got on the phone instead, demanding to know who had authorized a maintenance contractor to even be part of this conversation, and somewhere in the middle of that call, Dana simply walked out of the shack, crossed the tarmac at a pace just short of a full run, and climbed the boarding ladder of Tail 081 like she'd done it every single day of her life instead of not at all for the last 3 years. Her hands remembered before her mind fully caught up. Master arm switch, INS alignment, comm panel, oxygen check, harness cinched tight across her chest. The cockpit smelled the way it always had, ozone and old rubber, and something underneath that was almost like nostalgia, if nostalgia could arrive with a stomach full of dread riding shotgun alongside it. Cole's voice crackled through her headset before she'd even finished strapping in fully. Ma'am, this frequency isn't cleared for you, Captain Reyes is saying. Patch me to Havoc 11, Dana said, flipping switches with the muscle memory of 1,000 pre-flights. Authorization Wraith 6 actual. There was a pause on the other end, the specific kind of pause that means someone very young is staring at a screen without fully understanding what he's just heard. Ma'am, I don't have a call sign like that anywhere in the system. You won't, Dana said, throttle already coming up under her hand. It's not in your system, Cole. It's in his. The engine spooled to a full-throated roar behind her, and for the first time in 3 years, the sound didn't feel like a memory. It felt like coming home. The tower controller's voice, when it finally came through, sounded like a man deciding not to ask the questions he clearly wanted to ask and simply reading back her clearance instead. 300 miles east, Jim Osric had his rifle propped against the rock and his last 2 magazines laid out neatly on his knee, like a man counting down toward something he already knew the ending of. The wounded man beside him, a young corpsman named Alvarez, had gone quiet in a way Osric didn't like at all. Quiet was worse than screaming, in his experience. Quiet meant a body was starting to give up before the mind caught up to it. Ops desk still says 90 minutes, his radio man repeated, for the 3rd time now, as if saying it again might somehow shrink the number. I heard him the first time, Osric said, eyes scanning the tree through the rising smoke. He'd flown with pilots before who talked a good game and folded the second the tracers got close enough to feel the heat. He'd flown with exactly one who never had, not once, in 3 combat deployments together. She'd pulled his team out of a ravine once in conditions worse than this, so low and so tight that the jet wash had knocked loose dust off the rocks around them, and she'd never once raised her voice doing it. Not even a little. He hadn't heard her voice in 6 years. He hadn't expected to hear it again in this lifetime, if he was being completely honest with himself. Then his radio crackled to life, and a voice came through that stopped his heart cold for exactly 1 full beat before it started pounding twice as hard against his ribs. Havoc 11, this is Wraith. I hear you're having yourself a rough morning down there. He thought of the ridge from 6 years back, the smell of diesel and blood, and the calm voice that had talked him through the longest 10 minutes of his life. He'd told himself for years he'd made peace with never hearing that voice again, the way soldiers make peace with 100 things they never actually get over, not really, not fully. For a full second, Osric said absolutely nothing at all. His radio man looked at him like he'd just seen a ghost walk out of the tree, because in a very real way, he had. 6 years of complete silence, and that voice hadn't changed 1 single degree. Same flat calm, same dry edge underneath it all, like she was commenting on the weather instead of flying straight into a fight nobody had actually cleared her for. Say again, station calling. Osric managed, throat suddenly tight. Say your call sign again, please. Wraith, the voice repeated unhurried. Feet dry and 6 mics. Give me your position and your friendly's exact position, and don't you dare tell me you've forgotten how to read off a 9-line. Osric, I know for a fact you remember. His radio man stared at him, wide-eyed. Chief, you know this pilot? Personally? Osric was already grabbing the map board off his knee, hands steadier than they'd been in the last 20 minutes. 6 years ago, he said quietly. Worst day of my entire life. She was the only good part of it that survived. He keyed the radio again, voice suddenly sharper, sharper than the fear had let it be in over an hour. Wraith, be advised, hostiles are dug in along a wooded ridgeline 300 meters north of our position. Danger close. Repeat, danger close. My men are pinned in open rock with heavy sustained fire from the tree. Copy all, Dana said. Hold what you've got, Chief. I'm almost home to you. Around him, his team shifted, weapons still trained on the tree, but something in their posture had already changed, like men who'd just remembered hope was a real thing. Somewhere behind them, the wounded corpsman stirred slightly at the sound of the radio traffic, some part of him registering hope before the rest of him caught up to what it meant. Back at Desert Rim, Reyes was standing on the tarmac screaming something Dana could no longer hear over the spool of the engines, because tail 081 was already rolling, gear retracting smoothly, nose coming up into a sky the color of a fresh bruise just starting to bloom. She'd skipped half the checklist items that didn't matter today and doubled down hard on the ones that did. Weapons load was thin. This jet hadn't been configured for a real fight in years, but the GU-8 was still mounted, still armed for the range qualification runs nobody had ever bothered to remove, and right now that single fact was the only thing in the universe that actually mattered to her. She climbed hard, banked east, and let the old airframe find its rhythm again, the way a hand remembers a language the mouth had long forgotten how to speak. The instruments were achingly familiar under her fingers, even though her fingers hadn't touched them in years. Airspeed, altitude, fuel flow, the soft mechanical hum of a machine built to take punishment and keep flying anyway, no matter what. Wraith, Havoc 1-1. Osric's voice crackled through again, tighter now, closer to the edge than it had been a minute ago. We are being overrun. I say again, we are being overrun on all sides. I'm 11 minutes out, Dana said, pushing the throttles all the way forward. Make it 10 for me, Chief. Behind her, on a frequency she'd already stopped listening to, Reyes was demanding someone recall the aircraft immediately. Nobody could. She'd shut that channel off completely before she'd even left the ramp behind her. She didn't look back at the base shrinking behind her. She'd already decided, somewhere over the ramp, that whatever came after this flight, it could wait its turn. The old jet groaned in ways the newer airframes never did, every rivet a small reminder of how many hands had kept it alive. The forest below her, when it finally came into view through the haze, looked like something out of an old photograph, dark green canopy split by a gray granite spine, smoke already rising thin and gray from somewhere near the ridge itself. Dana dropped altitude in a tight spiral that would have made any passenger violently sick and made her feel, for the first time in 3 long years, entirely and terribly alive again. Havoc 1-1 Wraith, I have your smoke in sight, she said. Pop another for confirmation. Danger close is going to be tight down here. A moment later a second plume rose from the rocks, dangerously close. Too close, by any sane measure, to the treeline where muzzle flashes were stitching orange dashes through the deep shadow. Copy smoke, both confirmed, Dana said. Danger close is confirmed. All friendlies, get as low as you possibly can and stay there. This is about to get loud. Osric's voice came back low and fast, urgent. Wraith, hostiles are 20 meters from my perimeter. 20 meters. You understand exactly what you're being asked to do here. I taught myself math a long time ago, Chief, Dana said, rolling the jet onto a run line that threaded a gap in the canopy no wider than a driveway back home. Keep your heads down and trust me. She eased the throttles back, lined up the pipper on her HUD, and let 6 years of silence dissolve into 11 seconds of pure, terrible focus. Below, Osric pressed his cheek to the cold rock and prayed, in the specific wordless way soldiers pray, that the woman in the sky remembered exactly how close was too close. She thought, briefly and without any real bitterness, of every training flight she'd flown since leaving the fight, every one of them a pale rehearsal for a moment she'd told herself would never actually come again. The GU-8 opened up with a sound that wasn't so much a noise as a physical event, a buzzsaw growl that shook the entire airframe and rattled Dana's teeth loose in her skull, 30mm rounds walking a devastating line through the treeline at nearly 4,000 rounds a minute. On the ground, Osric felt the shock wave through the rock under his chest before he even heard the report roll down through the valley half a second later. The treeline simply erupted. Splinters, smoke, and worse things flew skyward in a churn of debris that swallowed the muzzle flashes whole in an instant. Guns, 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 Dana called out, pulling off the run in a hard climbing turn that pressed 4 full GS into her spine, the horizon spinning gray-green wildly below her canopy. She'd forgotten how much her body still loved this. She'd forgotten how much it would cost her afterward, too, but that particular bill wasn't due yet. Wraith, that's a hit. That's a confirmed hit. Osric's voice cracked with something that wasn't quite relief yet, not fully. Fire from the treeline is down. Repeat, down completely. Copy that, Dana said, already banking hard back around for a second pass, scanning for the last muzzle flashes that hadn't stopped completely. There were always a few stragglers who didn't stop the first time. There were always a few who had to be convinced twice, the hard way. "Setting up for gun run 2, she said calmly. "Keep your heads down, Chief. I am not done here yet." Somewhere in the smoke, a single hostile broke and ran for the far tree line, and Dana marked the position without a flicker of hesitation, filing it away for the next pass. Her instructor voice, the one she used with nervous students back at Desert Rim, was nowhere to be found right now, replaced entirely by something older and colder and far more precise. On the second pass, she came in lower, flatter, close enough that Osric swore afterward he could actually feel the jet wash rattle the leaves clean off the branches directly above his head. The remaining hostiles, the ones who hadn't broken and run at the first pass, made the fatal mistake of standing up to reposition, and Dana's second burst found every one of them before they'd even finished the thought. Silence came down over the ridge then, like a held breath finally released all at once. "Havoc 1-1, Dana said, voice steady as ever. "How copy? Status report." For 3 long, agonizing seconds, nothing came back. Then Osric's voice, hoarse, half a laugh and half something rawer underneath it. "Wraith, status is we're alive. Status is you just single-handedly saved 6 men who were about 90 seconds from becoming a statistics briefing back home. Corpsman's condition, status? Stable for now. Bleeding's controlled with direct pressure. He'll make it if we get him out in the next 20 minutes or so. Then let's get all of you out of there," Dana said, already climbing to orbit overhead, scanning the shattered tree line for any last flicker of movement below. "I've got eyes on your extraction route right now. It's clear for the moment. Move fast, Chief. Don't waste it." Below her, 6 exhausted men slowly rose out of the rocks they'd been pinned against for the better part of an hour, dragging their wounded brother carefully between them, none of them yet quite daring to believe the sky above them was actually, finally on their side. Osric's radio man was openly crying now, the kind of relief that doesn't care how it looks, and nobody around him thought less of him for it. Somewhere in the rocks, a younger operator muttered a prayer under his breath, spoken out loud simply because the moment demanded it. As the team began to move, Osric kept his eyes turned up more than he strictly needed to, like he was half afraid the jet might simply vanish if he looked away for too long. "Wraith," he said, quieter now, almost reverent, "I have to ask you something. Where in God's name did you come from? Command told us flat out there was nothing available in range." "There wasn't," Dana said simply. "Not officially, anyway." "Then how?" "I fixed the jets nobody remembers still exist, Chief. Turns out that's remarkably useful when you need one that isn't sitting on anybody's official schedule." Osric let out a long breath that sounded like it had been held for 6 full years, not 60 minutes. "Last I'd heard, Wraith flew out after that deployment and never came back stateside. Some of the guys figured you'd landed a cushy training command somewhere. Figured you were out teaching Butterbars how to land a T-38 safely." "Something like that," Dana said, and didn't bother to elaborate any further than that. Behind her, on a channel she'd almost entirely forgotten was still open, Reyes's voice finally cut back through, tight with a fury that had nowhere useful left to go anymore. "Tail 081, you are ordered to return to base immediately. Do you copy? Immediately. This is not a request." "Copy, Captain," Dana said evenly. "Give me 10 more minutes. I've got people to get home safely first." She didn't wait around for his answer. She doubted very much he had one worth actually hearing. Overhead, Dana throttled back slightly, watching the small dark shapes of 6 men moving in a tight, careful line across open ground toward the waiting helicopters. Osric's radio man kept glancing between the sky and his chief, like a man trying to memorize a moment he suspected he'd be asked to retell for years afterward, in bars and reunions and quiet conversations. The extraction bird, a pair of MH-60s that had been holding 20 miles out waiting on a green light nobody genuinely thought would ever come through, finally got their call to move. Dana held high orbit while they came in low over the ridge, rotor wash flattening the underbrush below, door gunners scanning a tree line that had gone eerily, blessedly quiet at last. Osric's team loaded fast, moving with the urgency of men who'd already accepted they might not get the chance twice in one lifetime. Alvarez went up first, strapped tight, and 4 lines swinging gently with the motion of the airframe underneath him. The rest followed in the controlled chaos of soldiers who'd rehearsed this exact motion 100 times in training and were, for once, deeply grateful for every single rehearsal. Wraith, all souls accounted for. Osric radioed, voice cracking now with something between exhaustion and pure disbelief. We are wheels up. We are wheels up right now because of you, and everyone here knows it. Copy wheels up, Dana said. Get that corpseman to a surgeon fast, Chief. That's an order from somebody who technically doesn't have any authority to give you orders anymore. Osric laughed, a real laugh this time, ragged around every edge of it. Wraith, after we land safely, I owe you a full debrief. And a drink. And probably an apology to whatever officer's about to chew your ear off for all of this. Add it to the tab, Dana said, already banking west, toward a runway where she already knew exactly what kind of reception was waiting patiently for her. She watched the birds lift off below her, rotor wash flattening the grass in wide circles, and allowed herself, just for a second, to breathe out the tension she'd been holding since takeoff. One young operator kept looking back at the ridge as the helicopter climbed, like he couldn't believe they were leaving it alive. The flight back gave Dana 11 long minutes to think, which turned out to be 11 minutes too many for her own good. Her hands stayed steady on the stick even as the adrenaline began its slow retreat, leaving behind the particular hollow ache she remembered from every mission that had ever truly mattered. Knees loose, jaw tight, the smell of gun smoke still clinging stubbornly to the cockpit vents like it had something left to prove to her. Below her, the desert rolled out flat and pale gold in the climbing morning sun, nothing at all like the black pine forest she'd just left behind her, and yet her mind kept looping back to it anyway. The smoke, the trilene, the sound of 6 exhausted men breathing easier through a shaking radio channel. She hadn't done anything like that in years. She told herself over and over that she didn't miss it one bit. She told herself a great many things over the years. Desert Rim's tower came up on the radio, clipped and formal as always, clearance granted for an aircraft that, as far as the official log was concerned, had never actually been cleared to leave the ground that morning in the first place. Dana brought tail 081 in on a long, clean approach, gear down, flaps set properly, the old airframe settling onto the runway with a kind of soft, practiced touch that no amount of paperwork violations could ever seriously argue against. Waiting for her on the tarmac was Captain Reyes, arms crossed, and behind him, it seemed like half the base had turned out to watch. Somewhere below, a rancher looked up at the sound of a jet that didn't belong on anyone's schedule and simply shrugged. She thought about Osric's voice cracking over the radio and felt something in her chest loosen slightly, a knot she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying around for 6 long years. Reyes was already moving before the engines had even finished spooling down, face flushed red, clipboard gripped in hand like it was some kind of weapon he fully intended to use on her. Kessler, you took an unauthorized aircraft off this field without clearance, without a proper flight release, without so much as a... Captain, Dana said, climbing down the ladder slowly, legs a little unsteady after the sustained G-load. There are 6 men and 1 corpseman who are going to land at a field hospital in about 40 minutes who otherwise wouldn't be doing that at all. I'll gladly take the paperwork after. This isn't about paperwork. This is about protocol. This is about a contractor deciding on her own that she has the authority to. I'm not a contractor, Captain, Dana said, cutting him off. Reyes stopped cold, thrown by the sheer flatness in her voice more than by the actual words themselves. I'm sorry, excuse me? 11 years active duty, Dana said. 10 pilot, 3 separate combat deployments, call sign Wraith. I took this job specifically because it let me stay near airplanes without anyone ever asking me to point one at another human being again. She pulled off her gloves, 1 finger at a time, entirely unhurried about it. Today, somebody needed me to do exactly that one more time. So I did it. The tarmac had gone very, very quiet around them. Somewhere behind Reyes, Young Cole had already pulled up her old service record on a nearby terminal, and his face had gone pale as printer paper. Cole, watching from the terminal, hadn't moved an inch, still staring at the screen like it might change its answer if he looked away and back again. Somewhere in the crowd that had gathered, someone had already started recording on a phone, though nobody would think to mention it until much later that same evening. Cole's voice cracked slightly as he read straight off the screen in front of him. Sir, her decorations list runs 3 full pages. Distinguished Flying Cross. 2 Air Medals with Valor. There's even a redacted commendation from some joint operation that I don't even have clearance to. Reyes looked at the screen, then back at Dana, then back at the screen again, the anger visibly draining out of his face and leaving something much closer to raw embarrassment behind it. You've been fixing hydraulic lines on this base for 8 straight months. You never once asked what I used to do, Dana said simply. You just assumed the worst and left it there. Before Reyes could formulate any kind of answer, the low, unmistakable thrum of rotor blades rolled across the flight line, and every single head on the tarmac turned toward the horizon at once. A pair of MH-60s came in low and settled onto the far end of the runway, dust boiling out from underneath them in a curtain that caught the morning light like gold smoke rising off the concrete. The rear door slid open, and Jim Osric stepped out first. Dust and dried blood streaked across a face that clearly hadn't slept in over a full day, and walked straight across the tarmac toward the woman everyone else on that base had spent the last 8 months simply calling the mechanic, without a second thought. He stopped 3 feet in front of her, straightened his spine despite the exhaustion clearly pulling at every part of his body, and snapped a salute so sharp it visibly looked like it hurt him to hold. The rotor dust was still settling around their boots, and nobody on that tarmac said a word for a long moment. Reyes's jaw worked silently for a moment, the particular expression of a man rapidly recalculating every assumption he'd made about a person over the better part of a year. Master Chief, Dana said quietly, you really don't have to do that out here. Yes, ma'am, Osric said, holding the salute a full beat longer than regulations strictly required of him. I absolutely do have to, and you know it. Behind him, the rest of his team filed slowly off the helicopter, and one by one, exhausted, filthy, half of them visibly limping, they fell into a rough line and did the exact same thing, a ragged row of operators standing rigidly at attention on a runway for a woman in grease-stained coveralls who 3 years ago they'd have all walked right past without a second glance. Reyes stood frozen at the edge of it all, clipboard entirely forgotten at his side now, watching 6 elite operators salute a contractor, like she was the highest-ranking officer on the entire field that day. In every single way that actually mattered, right now she genuinely was. For what it's worth, Osric said, lowering his hand slowly, voice rough with emotion, I told my team, before we ever went out on that operation, that if things went sideways bad enough out there was exactly one voice on this entire earth I'd want answering that radio. I never once thought I'd actually get to hear it again in this lifetime. Dana allowed herself for just one brief moment, something close to an actual smile. Get your corpsman to a hospital, Chief. Save the speeches for the official debrief. Copy that, Osric said.
Ma'am.
He said that last word like it weighed something significant. Somewhere behind the line of saluting men, a young airman quietly pulled out his phone to take a photo, then thought better of it and put it away instead. For just a moment, the whole flight line seemed to hold its breath along with him, waiting to see what a woman who'd spent 8 months being ignored would do with a runway full of grateful strangers. The next hour passed in the strange, muted chaos that always follows any close call in the field, medics checking Alvarez one more time before the ambulance rolled him toward the base hospital, Osric's team peeling off gear and drinking water like men who'd genuinely forgotten their own bodies needed it, Reyes standing off to one side making phone calls in a much quieter, much more careful voice than he'd used all morning long. Dana went back to the hangar. Nobody stopped her. Nobody quite knew how to, honestly, given everything that had just happened. She found Tail 081 already being carefully looked over by 2 junior maintainers who'd never so much as touched it before that day, running their hands reverently over the gun ports with a kind of respect usually reserved for museum pieces, which, technically, it had been up until about 2 hours earlier. She didn't bother correcting them. She just picked her toolbox back up and returned to the hydraulic line she'd left half-finished that morning because a job left undone was still, at the end of the day, a job. Her hands had stopped shaking somewhere over the desert on the long flight back. That, at least, hadn't changed one bit. She'd always been better at stillness than most people ever gave her credit for. It was, honestly, the only reason she'd ever been any good at the loud part of the job in the first place. Behind her, she heard boots on the concrete, slower than a marching pace, the unmistakable sound of someone working up the nerve to start a conversation. Somewhere across the flight line, Osric's team was already trading quiet stories about her, half of them exaggerated, none of them needing to be. She thought, not for the first time, that the quiet parts of a life were usually the ones that mattered most, even if nobody else ever noticed them or thought to ask. Ms. Kessler. It was Reyes, hat tucked under one arm now, none of the earlier heat left anywhere in his voice. I owe you a genuine apology. Dana didn't look up from the hydraulic fittings she was working on. You owe Havoc 1-1 a faster answer next time somebody calls in troops actively in contact. That's the apology that actually matters here. I'll take that under serious advisement, Reyes said, and to his credit, he actually sounded like he meant every word of it. For what it's worth, I looked through your file. All of it. What I'm cleared to see, anyway. I truly had no idea who you were. Most people don't, Dana said. I never told them to look, either. Why not, exactly? She set the wrench down finally, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. Because the version of me that people respect for the right reasons doesn't need a service record to earn that respect, Captain. And the version who only respects rank and paperwork was never going to listen to me anyway, file or no file. Reyes had nothing left to say to that. He nodded once, put his hat back on slowly, and for the first time since he'd arrived at Desert Rim 8 months earlier, walked away from her without giving a single order. Dana went back to the hydraulic line in front of her. It still needed fixing. Something simply didn't change just because the world found out who you used to be once upon a time. She almost told him then about the ridge 6 years ago, about Osric's face in the dust, about why she'd really left the noise behind. She decided that story belonged to someone else's telling, someday. He held out a hand then, not quite sure what else to offer her, and Dana shook it briefly, the gesture feeling almost strange after everything else that had happened that day. Some apologies didn't need more words than that. Osric found her an hour later, freshly showered, wearing a borrowed uniform 3 full sizes too big for him, looking like a man who'd aged a decade in a single morning and somehow also looked 10 years lighter for it at the same time. He held out a challenge coin, worn smooth and thin at every edge, the kind carried for years by men who'd been carrying it since a deployment neither of them ever talked about out loud. I've had this in my kit for 6 straight years, he said quietly. Told myself I'd give it back to you properly if I ever got the chance to say thank you the right way. Guess today's finally the day for that. Dana turned the coin over slowly in her palm, the metal still warm from his hand. You really didn't have to keep it that long, Chief. Didn't feel right letting it go before now, Osric said. Figured keeping it meant I still owed somebody something out there. Guess I was right to think that. He looked around the quiet hangar at the small life she'd built. You could have stayed in. Could have had your own squadron by now, easy. I got tired of being loud, Dana said simply, wiping her hands on the rag again. Some people need the noise to feel useful in this world. I never really did, not deep down. Osric nodded slowly, like he understood that better than most people ever would. Well, for what it's worth, the world got lucky you were still close enough to answer today. Somewhere behind them both, the desert wind picked up, carrying the smell of the coming evening, and neither of them felt any particular need to fill the silence with more words. Dana slipped the coin into her breast pocket, the same pocket where, 6 years ago, she'd once carried a photograph of a squadron that mostly didn't exist anymore, scattered now across a dozen different assignments. News of the sortie moved through Desert Rim the way it always does on small, close-knit bases, fast, quiet, and mostly true by the time it made the rounds. Nobody made any kind of formal announcement about it. Nobody really needed to in the end. By the end of that day, junior airmen who'd walked right past Dana 100 times before without so much as a second glance were suddenly finding excuses to stop by the hangar, offering to carry her toolbox for her, asking careful questions about her old squadron that she mostly deflected with a shrug and a small half-smile. She didn't especially want the attention. She'd never wanted it, honestly, not even back when she was flying real combat sorties with her name printed on official mission logs instead of routine maintenance work orders. But she noticed, without ever saying anything out loud about it, that Cole started saluting her in the hallway from then on, and that even Reyes, passing her on the flight line the very next morning, gave her a respectful nod instead of barking some order at her. It wasn't much in the end. It didn't really need to be much at all. That evening, after the debrief paperwork was finally signed off on, after Osric's team had been medevaced onward toward home, and the desert had gone that particular shade of deep orange it only ever turns right before full dark, Dana walked back out to Tail 081, sitting quiet on the flight line where it had sat, mostly forgotten by everyone else, for years and years before that morning. She ran a hand slowly along its worn fuselage, the way you'd quietly thank an old friend for showing up exactly when it mattered most. Even the base commander, a man who rarely left his office before noon, made a point of walking the flight line that afternoon, nodding once at Dana without breaking stride. She didn't fly it again the next day, or the day after that either. She went right back to pre-flight checks and hydraulic lines and the particular, unglamorous rhythm of a life she'd chosen entirely on purpose years earlier, because it let her keep her hands on airplanes without anyone ever asking her to point one at another human being ever again for the rest of her life. But something had shifted, quietly and permanently, in the way people at Desert Rim looked at her now. Not louder, exactly. Not showier in any obvious way. Just different, somehow, in a way that was hard to put into words. The way you look at someone once you finally understand what all that silence had actually been holding back the whole time. Rhea stopped by the hangar again a few days later, not carrying a clipboard this time, just a cup of coffee and an awkward kind of respect he clearly hadn't had much practice expressing before now. "For what it's worth," he said carefully, "I put in the paperwork for you to get a formal commendation for the sortie. Figured it was probably overdue by about 6 years at this point." "Don't bother on my account," Dana said, not unkindly. "I didn't do it for a ribbon, Captain." "I know that," Reyes said. "That's exactly why I put in for it anyway, if I'm being honest with you." Dana almost smiled at that, just barely. Somewhere out past the flight line, a training flight of 2 T-38s lifted off into the pale morning sky, and Dana watched them climb steadily, hands still smelling faintly of hydraulic fluid, feeling, for the first time in a very long while, entirely at peace with the quiet life she'd built for herself. She kept the challenge coin in her pocket after that, not on display anywhere, just close enough to feel its weight now, and then when her hand brushed against it. Weeks later, a small package arrived at the hangar with no return address at all, just a base postmark from a training command 3 states away from Desert Rim. Inside was a single photograph, 6 exhausted men standing in a loose line on a helicopter landing pad, dust still hanging thick in the air behind them, every single one of them looking straight into the camera like they knew exactly who it was actually meant for. On the back, in handwriting she recognized instantly without even having to think about it, Osric had written a single short line. "Some voices you never forget, no matter how many years pass. Thanks for still being one of them. Havoc 11." Dana pinned the photograph to the corkboard hanging above her workbench, right next to a faded old photo of her original squadron and a challenge coin that had finally found its way back home to stay for good. She didn't need the credit for any of it. She'd never once needed the credit, not really. But she let herself keep that photograph anyway, because some things you're allowed to be quietly, privately proud of, even when you never once talk about them out loud to another living soul. The desert sun rose the next morning the exact same way it always had, and Dana Kessler walked out to the flight line the exact same way she always did, coveralls on, toolbox in hand, ready for one more ordinary day spent fixing other people's airplanes for them. Nobody who watched her walk past that particular morning knew what she'd done 3 weeks earlier over a forest 600 miles away. She preferred it that way, honestly. Some heroes never need the whole world to know what they did. They just need to know it themselves, that when the radio finally called for help, they answered it without hesitation. She never wrote back. She figured he already knew what mattered. If this story hit you the way it hit us while we were writing it, do us a favor and smash that like button below. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people out there who might need a story exactly like this one today. Drop a comment down below and tell us honestly, if you were Master Chief Osric, hearing that specific voice come back over the radio after 6 long years of complete silence, what would you have said back first? We genuinely want to hear your answer. And if you haven't already hit that button, go ahead and subscribe right now, because we've got a lot more stories just like Dana's coming your way soon. Quiet heroes, hidden pasts, and the exact moments that finally bring them back out into the light where they belong. Thanks so much for watching all the way through, and we will absolutely see you in the very next one.